Hello, everybody. Welcome once again to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the wood of the holly under the sign. And across the digital divide today, I have really an incredible guest. I'm so honored and proud to have him here. He is, like I am, a native of LA, me from Los Angeles, and he from Lower Alabama. He is Robert Abraham Zellner, and he is part of a handful of young people that ignited a movement and invented a decade. He is one of the founding members of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and was at really ground zero as a nonviolent warrior in some of the most important struggles, which all of us today are the beneficiary of. He's here today. I want to welcome you to A Rebel Without Applause. I really appreciate you being here. Bob Zellner, thanks for being here. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you today out in LA? Is it clear today?
It's clear and sunny, and we are the beneficiaries of global warming here in the middle of November. It's warm and sunny, and one of the things is I'd read your book, which I want to just give a recommendation. It's called The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, a white Southerner in the freedom movement. It is a very compelling read, and it helps contextualize and help people understand this movement and your role in it. And it's also quite personal. So first, congratulations on the book, which I had opportunity to reread today. You're down in Lower Alabama. I'm curious because some of the chapters in your book, particularly when you're a kid, got me to thinking and wondering, is the fishing still as good in Mobile Bay as you described it going in your book?
Well, no, it's not as good as it was when I was a child. Um, and part of it is that we have Mobile Bay is the draining point for what is now known as the American Amazon, the most diverse, biodiverse place in the United States. And it drains almost all of Alabama, parts of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Georgia. So, we've had a drought recently in the last several months, if not a couple of years. So there's not much water coming down through the river systems into Mobile Bay, and um, the bay has been degraded in so many ways with industrial pollution almost all the way up to northern Alabama. And the baykeepers and a lot of people concerned about the climate have been taking action about Mobile Bay and the American Amazon, and things are improving. And people are beginning to learn and study about the importance of this um, biological treasure for the United States, and we don't want to destroy it.
Because reading your book, I was like, I got to get down there and get some oysters and maybe some shrimp and maybe some redfish. And, I got to get a little skiff and get back into those sloughs and maybe my fly rod will work down there. So I had the first question I had to ask was that. And I didn't think you were expecting it. So my question to you is an overall question, considering the work that you did that is so impressive. Um, you said this in your book. You didn't join the movement to free Black people. You said you joined it to free yourself.
Yes, that was very important because a lot of people, especially because of my name, Zellner, uh, they they very easily called me a damn Yankee from New York, Jew, in lover, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was very important for people to know that I was born and raised in South Alabama, and that's why Barry Brown insisted on calling the movie from my memoir Son of the South. And I think he was right to do that. I wanted to call it some form of Murder Creek because that's what I named my first volume of memoir, The Wrong Side of Murder Creek. But that was about growing up in East Bruton, Alabama, across Murder Creek from Bruton, which when I was in grammar school there, was the richest per capita town in the United States. I know there are a lot of towns in the United States that claim that at one time or another they were the richest per capita. But in Bruton and East Bruton in the 40s and the 50s, there were an outsized number of millionaires based on the timber industry, the fortunes left over from the days of slavery. And so I was always told that I was on the wrong side of Murder Creek, and I was on the poor side of the creek, and therefore I would never amount to anything. And then it was very pleasing after the book came out and the movie came out that I was invited several times to speak at the library in Bruton, Alabama, about my experiences in the civil rights movement. So right now, my prime occupation is telling the stories, and I love to do that. I'm writing the second volume of the memoir, and we're working on a limited, I still don't know what's the difference in a limited TV series and a TV series. If you start with a limited and it's very successful and they need to keep it as a series, wouldn't you do that?
Yeah, well, a limited series is like generally like a Band of Brothers, where it was 10. You know, it has sort of a beginning, middle, and an end, and it's a longer form, obviously, than a movie. Um, and we're seeing those all over the place. Actually, it's something that I've had to deal with as well, with my writing projects. One of the things I loved about your book is, well, of course, it's your own journey, and your dad, who was a Methodist minister, your grandfather before him, who was a Methodist minister, and they also both held memberships in that all-pervasive organization that really found its tentacles almost into every corner of society, and that's the Ku Klux Klan. And you came up against it as a student and as an activist. I'm just curious about that journey for yourself and your dad, especially.
Well, I think the most important Zellner story is the story of my father and his being raised in Birmingham, Alabama, as part of one of the most vicious clans in the whole United States. Probably the Clavern that was responsible for killing the 4 little girls when the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed. Not the same Clavern. So my father was able to break from the Ku Klux Klan, and his father, my grandfather, and my grandmother disowned my father and said that he was no longer a member of the family if he was going to desert the Ku Klux Klan. So it was my father who took the major step after he had gone to Germany and Poland and Latvia and Estonia and parts of the Soviet Union just prior to the Second World War. And that's when he was converted from being a Klansman to being what he described as a human being. And so he was the one that took the bitterness and pain of his own mother and father disowning him, and his brothers never spoke to him again in his entire life. That was how strong it was, the grip of the Ku Klux Klan on the families that they claimed as their own. And for my father to break from that took a lot of courage and a tremendous amount of pain on his part. So I admire his fortitude as he described wrestling with the angel, because after he came back from Europe and he had seen what the Nazis, that was his, those were his political soulmates, the Nazis. And when he began to identify with the Jewish underground and take messages and money from one group to another, he realized that if he was caught by the Gestapo or the KGB, he'd probably be executed. So he very bravely did his all of his months in Europe, and when he came back to the United States, he knew what we were up against in the war. And at that time, we lived over near Dothan, right off the base of Fort Rucker. So we had Army officers staying in the house with us. That we had to. In that time, you had to. There weren't enough barracks for all the servicemen that were flooding into the armed forces. So we had officers from Fort Rucker staying with us in Loxley. I'm not in Loxley, but in Slocum and Newton. So, I remember me and my four brothers all dressed up in little army uniforms because we were really with all of the people who, as one of the colonels that stayed in our house, he said when it was time for him to go to Europe to join the war effort, he said, "I'm off to fight the Hun." So the Hun was the bête noire of all people in the United States. And now there's a huge number of people in the United States that think that Hitler was just fine, and we'd like to have one of our own, but we're not going to go that way. And we're going to fight a revolution against the dark forces and the people who want to go back to racism and hatred. And I'm confident that we will prevail. I don't know how long it's going to take. I probably won't see it in my lifetime, but I never thought I'd see a black president of the United States, and I did.
I
And
didn't.
we helped very much get him to be president of the United States. And now we want to make the United States safe for the world. We tried to make the world safe for democracy, we said, but we wound up propping up a lot of dictators around the world. So we have to look at our enemy outside and in.
Well, about Barack Obama, people used to ask me, "Well, Bill, when do you think Cal will ever get where I went, Berkeley, will ever get to the Rose Bowl?" And I said, "Well, probably be a black president before Cal gets to the Rose Bowl." I was right. I didn't even know, but we still haven't gotten there. So, yeah. Well, the political history of America it's a tortured one. I can say my mother was born in Germany, and I'm Jewish, and she left as a very little girl. So I don't know if that qualifies as a survivor. I know she was fortunate with her parents to get out and come to America. And I grew up around a lot of my friends who were from Poland, or their families were. And I remember seeing the numbers on the arms as a kid. And, they would rail against the evil Germans. And I'd hear this a lot. And I often thought, well, maybe fascism isn't just a German problem. Maybe it's actually a human problem, as opposed to just something restricted to one nationality. And I think that truth has been borne out, especially in our own country. We've seen it, the political specter of it. What I'm curious is how, within your own soul, with it just, society was so stratified, segregation was so harsh. How did you start to feel? Was it from things your father told you or observed that there was like another alternative, another possibility to this sort of, Jim Crow past that had preceded you by about 100 years almost?
Well, it was a great challenge, and it was extremely exciting. And I do have to give some accolades to the United Methodist Church at that time. Well, in fact, it wasn't the United Methodist Church because it was segregated. But when my father came back and other ministers, especially in Alabama, and someone recently wrote a book called The Cradle of Freedom. And I think it's a play on the South, especially Alabama, and Montgomery, Alabama, always was called the cradle of the Confederacy. And now we have Mr. Fry has written a book called Cradle of Freedom. And that's because so many people came from Alabama who were in this struggle. And I think maybe that's where you get your best fighters is where things are worse, and you have almost no choice. And when I was in college and given an assignment in sociology for a class to study the racial problem and write a paper about proposed solutions to the racial problem. And when I started working on that, even though I was a junior or senior, I've forgotten. It might have been the end of my junior year. We were told that we couldn't meet with any Black people. We couldn't talk to the students from Alabama State. We couldn't go and talk to Ms. Rosa Parks or Dr. Martin Luther King or E.D. Nixon or Joanne Robinson or any of the people that made the Montgomery bus boycott. And we told our professor, we said, how can we write a paper about the racial problem if we're not able to talk to half the people that are involved in the problem? We can only talk to white people about the racial problem. And we said, we're going to go do it anyway. And they said, well, you'll have to resign from school. And I remember thinking, well, I'm not a pre-law student, but I can tell the difference between you are expelled and you have to resign. And there were 5 of us that went to meet with Ms. Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and Brother E.D. Nixon. And we were all told that we had to resign from college because we had broken the segregation laws and brought dishonor on Huntington College campus. Now, we were a Methodist school, followers of John Wesley, and the Methodists had always had been opposed to slavery during slavery times, and now was opposed to segregation. And so the Methodist Church played a very important part in opening the door to young white Methodists all over the Deep South, because every time they had a national gathering of Methodist youth, it was very specifically interracial. And it was the first opportunity that many of us had ever to meet young people who were actual peers of ours. They were also high school students or college students. And so the progressive side of the Methodist Church was a subversive institution in the Deep South. But it allowed us to go to Dallas and places like that. And I remember going to Dallas when I was still in high school for the National School on Alcohol Studies. And there they had Odetta and Harry Belafonte and all kinds of people who were famous, well-known people who were encouraging us to get involved as young people and get involved with the racial problem. So I had all kinds of help in ushering me into the struggle. And if I hadn't gotten involved in the civil rights struggle, I don't know what kind of life I would have had. I might have been a Methodist minister, and there I would have been faced with the same problem. So you can't get away from the racial problem in the South because it's so deeply ingrained in our history and our history of genocide and racial hatred and misogyny, rules and regulations and all kinds of oppression of women. So all of those things that we were programmed to be on the progressive side of that, and not just in our thinking, but in our action, because that was what was important. And that's what Dr. King said in his letter from the Birmingham jail. He said he's not so disappointed in his opponents because they've always been opponents. He said the people that gave him the most trouble were not the enemies of the Black people, but the the friends of Black people who stayed silent and didn't take action. So the important thing we were told as young people is that first you have to get your beliefs and your and your purpose in mind, and then you have to act. Doesn't do any good how doesn't matter how liberal your thinking may be or how informed you are on any particular subject. If you don't take action, there's very little result.
Speaking of taking action, I wanted to kind of flash back to that most important day in the spring of 1961 when you're in Montgomery and those buses arrive at the terminal there, and you're an eyewitness to a pretty incredible event where John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, James Werg, Mr. Siegenthaler are all present. And just I would like for you to reflect on that most important day. And also, it seemed like that was a pretty critical day in your own life in terms of prompting you into your future.
Oh yes, it was, and I think I'm not sure if I wrote about much in the book, but in the movie, there was quite a bit of attention paid to the fact that um, Mr. Ang, who was played by Ludi Lin, who we'll talk movies just a minute. He's a very popular actor in China, and so we wanted to have a Chinese person in the cast of Son of the South, and I think that was part of my uh, my motivation for getting involved and taking action was that so many people were coming from New York and California and other countries to take action on our racism of the South. And am I not going to do that? If people are coming from all over to take action on something that I've grown up with, I need to be involved in that myself. And it was quite easy because of the preaching of my father and my grandfather, and my older brother was also a Methodist minister. So, and they were all preaching the early Christian church, which was that you had to take a risk for what you believed in, and it was a capital crime in some places of the Middle East at that time. If you just to be a Christian, or you could be fed to the lions, or be killed by gladiators and so forth, or thrown in a furnace, or put on a cross. And so they were people that really they put their lives on the line for their beliefs, and so that was what we were supposed to do as young Christians. We were supposed to do the right thing, and if it meant taking a risk, we had to do that. But it was also a savior for us, as Jim Lawson taught us, that when you turn the other cheek, and when you go to the most dangerous places, and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, took that as our particular responsibility. We were young. We didn't have families to support. We didn't generally have jobs that we had to go to. And so we were free to go to the most dangerous places. And we said, our job is to go to the most dangerous places and take away the fear of lynching and castration and so forth. All of those things they've used to keep Black people and immigrants and women in line. We have to oppose that. And once you decided, as I did, that I was going to do that, and I was going to go wherever I was needed wherever I was needed to go, and that I would not worry about saving my own life. And that's why when I was captured by the Ku Klux Klan and they took me to a tree and put a rope around my neck and around the limb, and they said, we're going to hang you. And I believed them 100%, but I was not fearful because I had already decided that I wouldn't be here if I hadn't already decided that I might lose my life. So I was not afraid, and which may have helped me save my life because they knew, they could tell that I was not afraid. And God put Doc in the lynch mob, and he kept calling me by name because we were both classmates at Huntington College. And the old Klansman said, "What are you calling him?" And he said, "Zellner, Bob." And he said, "You know this guy?" And he said, "Yeah." And so they realized I was not from New York. I was not a Yankee, and I was not Jewish, even though my wife and both daughters are Jewish. And I was convinced that that was going to be the shortest civil rights career ever because it was the first demonstration I ever participated in. And I said, they're going to hang me today. That's a very short civil rights career. And here I am at 84, and I'm looking at another 25 or 30 years of work. And I recently found out, because I was doing some checking on my ancestry on my mother's side,
Mm-hmm.
I found out that I have a great grandparent, apparently, who was documented to live to the age of 117.
Oh,
So I'm 84 now, so 15 and so I might have to work for another 30 years.
32. Yeah, you got another 30, you know. Well, what you're talking about, I want to put some context for the people that are listening. You're talking about your experience in Macomb, Mississippi with Bob Moses when guys were trying to register voters. I guess that would be in the fall of 61. And the moment that I originally referred to would be in the spring of 61 when the Freedom Riders arrive in Montgomery. And you, according to your book, witnessed the assault on them at the bus terminal.
Oh yes, I was. We had decided the 105, the ones that had been were going to be asked to resign from school. We had decided that when the Freedom Riders got to Montgomery, we were going to go down to the bus station and be there as observers. We hadn't had any nonviolent workshop training at that point, but we would just be there. And I had already decided that if I saw somebody about to be beaten to death in front of me, I was going to take some kind of action.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, I was a martial arts instructor in college, so I didn't know much about nonviolence, but I believed that I could save somebody's life if they're about to be beaten to death in front of me. And so I had decided to do that. And then very soon after that, I decided I was going to join these people. They were taking action about things I cared deeply about, and that was the group I needed to be with.
How did how did you meet? I'm sorry. Go ahead. How did you meet James Lawson?
I met Jim Lawson in the summer of 1961 because I had gone to, when I graduated Huntington, because I said I'm not going to resign, and if you want me to leave, you have to expel me. And they didn't have the intestinal fortitude to expel me, so I just graduated by default in the spring of 1961. And I had already met Ann Braden, of Ann and Carl Braden, of the Southern Conference Educational Fund. And they told me about that Highlander was going to have a lot of high school students from all over the South for a summer at Highlander in preparation for going into integrated classrooms in implementation of the Supreme Court ruling on school desegregation. And so I went to spend the summer of 1961 at Highlander Folk School, which was then in Mont Eagle, Tennessee, not too far south of Nashville.
Right.
And one of the people working at Highlander that summer was Susan Wilbur, who was from Nashville, and she had already been in a couple of nonviolent workshops with Jim Lawson, and she and I became very friendly during the summer. And she said, "I want to go to Nashville as many weekends as possible so I can go to the workshops with Jim Lawson." And so we started every weekend that we could possibly go. We would drive up to Nashville and go to the workshops. So I had the privilege of one of the few white Southerners from the Deep South to be in Jim Lawson's nonviolent workshops very early on. And probably if many people in SNCC had not had Jim Lawson's workshops on nonviolence, they would not have survived the movement, because the nonviolence actually saved our lives at times. Because if there are 400 people with baseball bats and pipes and bricks, you can't meet them with anything other than nonviolence. And because if we'd try to defend ourselves, then they would gladly have killed us, and then everybody would say, "Well, they were fighting." So we had to maintain the moral high ground by being nonviolent, and also help save our lives and many lives, I think.
So that summer of 1961 sounds quite idyllic indeed, as you describe it in your book, at the beautiful Highlander Folk School with the great troubadour Carawan, Guy Carawan, and then I guess those workshops, they'd already had this tremendous victory in Nashville in the preceding, well, I guess the 61. Oh, my time, 1960, the spring of 60, they had a tremendous victory at the lunch counters with Diane Nash and Bevel and Lafayette and John Lewis. So by the time you arrived, they've had this, they must have been very confident in a way about these ideas and strategies and disciplines, because they'd had some major victories in terms of downtown Nashville.
That's right. It was great for nonviolent direct action that it proved itself to be effective for integrating lunch counters, theaters, bowling alleys, all those things. And that's how SNCC did a lot of its early organizing. We'd send 2 or 3 organizers into an area like Albany, Georgia, and they might spend 2 or 3 weeks in pool halls and at the YMCA, YWCA, churches, wherever they could go, talking to young people. And the movement was in the air, so everybody knew about it. It wasn't a surprise to anybody. But when SNCC came along, it gave an opportunity for young people, a great way for them to immediately get involved. So we had huge successes in Albany, Georgia, when Charles Sherrard and several other early SNCC freedom singers went down to Albany and started working with young people, and they came in quickly. The older people and opening up the churches was took longer, because the older people were more cautious, right. And it took a while to convince the the churches to open the doors for mass meetings. And Joanne Bland tells a great story about how the churches were opened up in Selma when Bernard went there to start organizing. It took quite a while before they were able to have mass meetings at churches. And the first mass meetings they had, anytime that an old civil rights battler may die, they would use the funeral because Selma couldn't keep you from having a funeral. And so they use the funerals as mass meetings.
As a matter of fact, the whole Selma movement starts really, or it gains traction or accelerates following the murder of Jimmy, I forget the young man's name. It was a black person that was murdered that really accelerates the Selma experience. I'm going to throw some names by you, and I just want you to respond. We already mentioned James Lawson, and that's where I met you at his 95th birthday gathering at Holman Methodist here in Los Angeles. But here, I just want to throw some names out because they're so important to me. Let's start with just Diane Nash and your recollections.
Diane Nash. Well, Diane brought with her from, I think it was Michigan, mainly. She came down.
Chicago.
Chicago. Yeah. And she brought the outrage of young people from the North coming into the South. And they knew that there was discrimination in Chicago and all these other places, but it wasn't blatant like public accommodation segregation in the South. And who was the ridiculous person that ever decided that they could segregate black and white in a town like New Orleans? Because there were so many families that went all the way from the white side of the family all the way over to
so mixed, yeah.
All got together for funerals and weddings and things like that. So you were going to have to segregate members of the same family from each other. They couldn't go into the same place and have a cup of coffee.
Here's another name. I find him incredibly interesting, having written about him. James Bevel.
Oh, James Bevel, the crazy genius. Yes, Bevel was always. I remember whenever I would be on. Sometimes Bevel and I would speak at events, and he would call me Reverend Zellner, Reverend Bob, and I would always say, Jim, I'm not a reverend. I'm not ordained. And he'd say, Bob, to me, you will always be a reverend. He was bodacious and he could convince anybody of anything. So he was just very persuasive, and that's why Bevel was probably the one person that was more responsible for anybody else of the success of the Birmingham movement, because he said the children want to be involved and they should be involved. And we're going to have workshops with them about how to march and how to handle the dogs and the police and so forth. But of course, they had no idea that the dogs and the police and the fire hoses were going to be so overpowering, and they would have a grown white person like Bull Connor, who would gladly turn fire hoses on people that would break bones, split breasts open, knock eyes out, knock people through plate glass windows, and but that's what carried Birmingham over the top. And now we have a situation in Alabama, so that Alabama is embracing civil rights tourism now. There's a tremendous business now in Alabama of tours, people coming to go to Selma, to go to where all do we go? We go to Selma, we go to Tuskegee.
Montgomery, Birmingham. I mean, they're all there.
Now Mobile with the Cotillion, the last slave ship. So there's a huge business now in Alabama of civil rights tourism, and so that's why we're here in Fairhope, and we hope to. We're going to start a conference center, I think, here in Fairhope for young people to come when they need to rest a little bit. We're close to the beach down at Gulf Shores, and we're in walking distance of the Beach. And the only thing you have to do is read the signs. It says, "Beware of snakes and alligators," and you're all right as long as you're watchful. And don't bring your little dog down there because the alligator will grab the dog and run off with it.
You know, one of the things about your book that was so thrilling is that you're basically interacting. You're a celebrity yourself, and you're interacting with some of the great celebrities of the 1960s, whether they're in show business or civil rights. So I'm going to throw another name at you. This gentleman was a friend of mine, and I knew him, and we played baseball together sometimes. He lived here in Southern California, but he was there with you in Macomb. Tom Hayden.
Oh yeah, Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden. Well, Tom was the intellectual of our group, and he was during a lot of the time in Atlanta when he married Casey Hayden. He was working on the Port Huron statement, so we would all get together and work on that, and then after he was in Macomb, and he wrote Revolution in Mississippi or something like that. So Tom was always doing some kind of writing and doing some kind of action, like going on the Freedom Ride. We were all part of the. I was present at the first Freedom Ride in Montgomery, and I was on the last Freedom Ride that was from Atlanta to Albany, Georgia, along with Tom Hayden, Casey Hayden, Per Lausen, who was a Danish
Right.
journalist who wrote a book about the South, and I'm not sure I ever got saw the book. His working title was Grace and Grits.
You mentioned that in the book, yeah, but you never saw the book.
No, no, I think I saw the book one time, and I was there. I was in Paris, and I walked by a bookstore, and there was a book. Sometimes a bookstore will put
Right.
100 copies of the same book in the window, and there was my face right there on the book, and I think it was
Per Larson.
Lausen's book. Whether it was still called Grace and Grits, I don't know, but I zipped in and bought a copy of it, and it was in French, so I guess it was translated from the English to to Danish and then to French, and so I came back to New York with a copy of it, and I showed it to a friend. As soon as I saw my friend, I showed it, and they said, "Oh, I speak and read French. Give me the book, and I'll tell you what it's about." And so I gave them the book. They disappeared with it, and I forgot who I gave it to. That's the last I ever heard of it.
One of the figures that you already mentioned it, but he figures quite prominently is Stokely Carmichael, and I'm curious about your relationship with him, particularly as your term or tenure with SNCC draws to a close.
He didn't believe in some of the basic tenets that SNCC believed in. And one of the things that we were not supposed to do is be self-promotional. So we had no matter how long you were associated with SNCC, it was not considered good form to be self-promotional. And that's why Stokely got the nickname in SNCC as Star Michael. Because he was funny. He was one of the original rappers. He could rap for an hour without stopping, and he said he was very witty and very funny, And it didn't always work to our advantage because many of the early writers on the women's movement picked out SNCC as one of the most chauvinistic of all the civil rights organizations, when the opposite was true. We had more strong women leaders than any other civil rights organization because of Ms. Ella Baker, who insisted that we understand and appreciate the leadership that women had always played in the civil rights movement, because a lot of times the women were more outspoken than the men were. And there was a practical reason for that too, because maybe Black women were slightly less likely to be lynched than Black men if they got out of line. So many times the Black women were the civil rights leaders, and sometimes they had to reach back and get a hold of the men and pull the men forward and say, "You need to give some leadership." And that was exactly at the same time the women's movement was reaching up and getting the men and saying, "You need to stand in the back for a while." So the white women wanted to get the men out of the way, and the Black women wanted to bring the men to the forefront. So there's always contradiction. And if you study Marx and the Marxist philosophy of dialectics, you can understand what is going on in the movement. Because while one part of the movement is going in this direction for a good reason, another part of the movement is going in the other direction also for a good reason.
I guess the temptation of self-promotion is something that's just common to all of us. Another person that was part of this movement, who went on to political fame, is Marion Barry. Obviously, becomes a well-known, a national mayor of Washington D.C. and
Mayor for life.
Yeah, and a figure of controversy himself. So, I guess that's problematic. There's so many people that you've traversed so many important personalities. You yourself are an important personality. One of the stories I loved in your book is how you ended up in the Oval Office staring down the likes of Lyndon Johnson.
Oh yeah, that was in the early summer of 1964, Freedom Summer in Mississippi, because the three civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner, were all disappeared in Philadelphia. So I spent the first part of the summer of '64 traveling with Rita Schwerner. We were in Oxford, Ohio, at the orientation session when the three disappeared, and I came down to Mississippi, to Meridian, with Rita Schwerner, and I spent about the first 3 or 4 weeks of the summer going with her all over Neshoba County and Philadelphia, Mississippi, and then later on into Jackson, where we met with Governor Paul Johnson, and also with the president's. Lyndon Johnson had a personal representative in Mississippi because
John Doerr, D-O-A-R. I don't know it.
John Doerr was very much involved, but the first person that he had in charge of things was Dulles. Allen, was it Allen
Dulles, who was a big political family in the United States.
Yeah, the brother of
John Foster
Dulles, who was Secretary of State maybe at the time.
Yes.
And so we wound up going to D.C. after we had done everything we could in Mississippi. We went with Congressman Fitz Ryan to Washington to meet with Lyndon Johnson. And I remember when we went to into the Oval Office, I believe it was Jim Foreman and Rita Schwerner and me and Rita. And LBJ came out of the one side of the office, and he walked across the room, and he took Rita's little hand in both of his, and he said, "I'm so pleased to meet you." And she said, "Mr. President, this is not a social visit." And whoop, Pierre Salinger was there. He was the, I guess, the spokesperson,
Press secretary.
press secretary.
Mm-hmm.
And he rushed us out. And Johnson, Lyndon said, "I would like to spend some time with you, but I have a meeting of the National Security Council, and I have to run off." So he left. And then Pierre Salinger dressed us down for about a half an hour and said, "You don't talk to the President of the United States like that, young lady." And she said, "I do." And she was always very bodacious, and she would say the most outrageous things to the most powerful people. And that was good. That was good training right there.
Was your perception that he was an ally or an adversary?
Well, he was a little bit like John F. Kennedy. We had to drag John F. Kennedy into the civil rights movement, and it's amazing that he's known now as one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement. But I think Bobby Kennedy was much more movement. He really had it more in his heart than his brother John, and so it is amazing that in a lot of houses years later, all over the South, we'd see Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, all together. And we'd always remember how we had to drag John F. Kennedy screaming, struggling and screaming into the civil rights movement. But that was what was happening. And Dr. King, at the end, basically in 1968, when he was assassinated,
Mm-hmm.
a very low approval rating. About 24% of the people in the United States approved of Martin Luther King, and most people didn't. So we just pretended we had tremendous support, and that was what was so important about the March on Washington in '63, because so many people in the civil rights movement were thinking, so many of us have given so much, and there's been so much suffering. We really need the nation to say that they approve of what we're doing, and that's the message we took from the March on Washington in '63. That they expected 100,000 people, and 250,000 people came, and so it was an affirmation that what we had been doing for a long time was the right thing to be doing and going in the correct direction. And I'm still trying to figure out where we took a U-turn after that as a country. We decided at some point, oh, it's too hard to get people together. It's much easier to keep them apart and fighting each other. So let's go that way. And let's elect a president who was in favor of people fighting each other and in favor of racism and homophobia, anti-Semitism, all those things. And that's a true representative of the United States, they thought.
Well, I always felt that, you're from the South, hundreds of thousands of young men marched willingly and thrillingly to their death in the Civil War to defend slavery and those that had slaves. And I always felt, and you must have felt it way more deeply than I did, I never lived in the South, that those people or their legacy, they're still here. They don't really go away. Those huge rivers or currents within our national psyche are still flowing for better and worse. And it seems like it's just, like it's Old Man River in a way to me.
Yes, yes.
I don't know if that's a pessimistic view or it's a way to just say the struggles that you're engaged in, they don't really end because these forces are still within us as Americans and humans probably also. I mean, that's sort of when I take the long view of history, it just, I mean, I'm curious in your case, growing up in the cold white heart of that Confederate iceberg. I mean, you had to have had great grandparents and great great grandparents that died and fought at all these, incredible battle sites, some of whom still had muskets and letters and old uniforms in their homes.
Oh yeah, everybody had their old muskets and their old Confederate battle flags, and it was it was wrenching to grow up in a culture when all of those things were revered, and then to suddenly start finding out, well, what do they represent? And so much of it represented injustice and genocide, and that's something that in just about every right-left struggle in the world, it's a lot of it is about the people who lived there originally, and it was um, that's one of the reasons I'm not formally a Christian anymore. I'm studying the Baha'i religion, which has as its main it has two main principles, and that is racial justice and the rights of women. So, in terms of trajectory, the direction that we've been going in, I was not allowed in the Christian community because the Christian community had become anything but Christian.
Yeah.
And if I was going to be kicked out of my Methodist school because I tried to do something about racial discrimination and inequality, there was no way that I was going to be a Christian minister. I was a ministerial student when I first went to Huntington, but by the time I graduated in 1961, I knew there was no way that I was going to be a minister, a preacher of the Christian gospel in Alabama, Mississippi, and the Deep South, because the Christians had abandoned the teachings of Jesus, and that's the basis of Christianity. That's why Christ is called Christ, and Christians are called Christians. And if you have done away with Jesus, there's no more reason to be a Christian.
I love what George Bernard Shaw said. He says the only trouble with Christianity is that nobody's ever tried it, which I thought was one of the great lines ever written.
Yeah. And very much the same thing with socialism. It's never been tried because it always winds up in a dictatorship.
Exactly. We have the foibles of humanity and these ancient tensions between individualism and collectivism. They never go away. They're constantly in conflict. One of the reasons I love sports, especially basketball, is because there's always this tension between the star and the group. And sometimes the talent of the star actually has a way of defeating the group. And sometimes you see the triumph of the group with the star. And I feel like those tensions in our world, in our society, don't go away. They're just there, and they're always in play. And the last sort of thought and question I had for you, hi there.
I just have to fix something on the computer. There you go.
Thank you. Is, one of the things that I've struggled with, I mentioned it early, is, having studied Gandhi, having been to the Lawson workshops, trying to make sense of this nonviolent discipline. What I've struggled with personally is, and I'm curious to your reaction, is as a mechanism, as a tool, as a discipline to advance social justice or fairness, just fairness, like fairness. It felt to me like that the nonviolent Gandhian discipline was extremely effective. It was like this incredible tool. It showed that in a country drenched in violence, that nonviolence could indeed prevail. And that was, to me, the triumph of the sort of what Lawson achieved. But when I look at some of the things like in the Ukraine, and I see this genocidal assault. There's plenty of examples in history, but just to say right now, this genocidal assault on Ukrainians by the Russian government or the Russian army, the nonviolent alternative for me, intellectually, I'm saying it comes up short, or I don't have a clear answer, or I don't know what to do in terms of those ideals and thoughts. And I was wondering, what, not that you have an answer, but what your journey has been with some of those same questions.
Oh, yeah. Well, those are very basic questions, and the conclusion that I've come to is that you have to discern what is true. It's hard to tell what's true now because so much passes for the truth, and so you first have to decide what is true and what you yourself believe, and and there's a way to figure out who is true. Is the right wing? The right wing says that the progressives or the left wing are trying to do exactly what they're trying to do. It's a projection on the part of our enemies to us, and they attribute to us their bad behavior. And the way you can tell which one is correct is to look at what are their goals, what are their aims, what are they aiming to do? Are they aiming to bring people together to resolve differences? Are they aiming to do away with the injustices that have plagued our history? Are they upholding women and giving them the freedom that they deserve as humans? And usually the answer, if the answer is not that we're our side is going in a humanitarian direction, a direction of equality and justice, and the other side is clearly going in the opposite direction. So that's the way you can tell that you're going in the right direction. And if you can do it nonviolently, there's lots of beauties of nonviolent struggle. And that is that you don't make enemies, you make
Allies.
Allies and friends.
Mm-hmm.
And that way we build while they are falling apart. And I think that's going to be the history of our next 30 or 40 years. And I'll see hopefully about half of that.
So, like Gandhi said, it's his experiment with truth is sort of what's true and what's real, what direction. I often ask, or the question I like to ask, because these conversations are harder to have because I don't see that many Trumpy people. I don't talk to them. They're not in my world. I don't see them. But the question I sort of have is, what's the perfect world that you guys imagine or you're envisioning? What is this world that is better that you're imagining? Explain it to me so that maybe I can get some insight into your thinking. And it's a tough conversation. I really haven't been able to have it, that many of them.
Yes. Well, part of the self-preparation, I think, is to be comfortable with uncomfortability. In other words, you need to be creatively insecure because you're not. About the only time you're going to be secure is when you're completely relaxed. And you're not going to be completely relaxed, I don't think, until you're dead. Because if you're completely relaxed, there has to be part of your body that is still in some kind of tension, or if you're completely relaxed, you're basically dead. So that's it's deciding what you believe in, taking action, and taking the consequences. And that's why I think that in the long run, we will be victorious, because I think that basic human nature is good. And some of the old Christian doctrine is that we're all born with original sin, so why not sin some more? I guess, I don't know. but they're definitely sinning, but I don't think they have a sense of sin. Um, and it's amazing because of what we say we believe in and what we do. And that was one of the things that influenced me to get together with the people who are actually doing something about the evils, rather than just lamenting the evils and hope that somebody does something to make things better. We are the ones that have to do something to make things better.
That's what I sort of took from, my readings and of Gandhi, is that his notion of spirituality was a pursuit of truth followed by action. The action actually is a spiritual act. And I think sometimes in America, what we're sending our prayers when there's a mass murder, we're sending our hopes and prayers, but it doesn't confer any obligation to any kind of creative action to remedy it. It's just we can pray or think it, and that's enough. But Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Lawson, all these people saying, well, the true path towards this kind of spirituality, there's a proponent that demands action. I think that's what you're saying, and that's sort of what I've taken from it. Gee whiz, Bob, I'm so impressed with your life and your story and your book. I recommend it. The Wrong Side of Murder Creek, your story in the civil rights movement. There's so much to talk about. I mean, I could go on forever.
We're going to talk again one of these days. We'll get together out there. We're coming out to LA pretty soon.
Oh, when?
Well, we're going to be in Seattle. Probably we're supposed to go to New Zealand for 3 months or 6 months, even depending on what happens in the world.
Yeah.
But we'll be coming to Los Angeles because we're hopefully going to be working on a TV series.
Well, let me know. And I look forward to meeting you again in person. And I just want to say a couple of things on behalf of my generation, which is a little younger than yours. I want to thank you because our world is infinitely better for the risks that you took when I was just a toddler. And I appreciate that. And I want to, at the very least, I think the storytellers, there's a place for that in this world too, to dispel what I call the mythology of our history in favor of the truth. That's one of the things that Howard Zinn did so well. So thanks for joining me on A Rebel Without Applause. And till next time, and I hope there is one, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha, and I'll see you.